Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Tuesdays With. This is our third season of lectures, sponsored by the Friends of the Georgetown Library. My name is Bob Willey, and for the last several years I've had the privilege of serving as the president of the Friends of the Georgetown Library. So we're so glad you're here today to hear Tuesday with Paige Sawyer. And he's my teacher. I've learned quite a bit from him, so it's nice to be able to have one of my teachers come as we've gotten to know Georgetown. Paige Sawyer is 7th generation South Carolinian, has lived in Georgetown for more than 45 years. What's the total right now, Paige?
47.
47. A veteran and very active in Veterans Affairs here in Georgetown and in South Carolina. Photographer by profession, as many of you already know. He's an instructor with Coastal Carolina University, a tour guide par excellence. He did a tour of Georgetown for us, for the Friends of the Library back last spring, which was wonderful. Community activist, and I think the highlight is he's a good friend of the Friends of the Georgetown Library and a good friend of mine. Please join me in welcoming Paige Sawyer.
Thank you, sir. Now, Bob won't say this, but I will. He said he's been doing this job for 3 years, and he has done an excellent job with the Friends of the Georgetown Library, and he is always there. He's very consistent, he's very dedicated, and we're glad to have him.
And I let him in first at our book sales.
I want to talk about that.
Anybody else that wants to spend $1,000 can get in early too.
You know, since we're going to be talking about Northerners and Southerners today, and I know a lot of you remember, or some of you may not, but Louis Grizzard, anybody remember Louis Grizzard? He was a Southerner, and he wrote excellent articles for the Atlanta Journal. And he would pick on Yankees, he would pick on Rebels, it didn't make any difference, but he always had a good story. He put out several books, and at the book sales that Bob has, you can find several of his books. But I'm always, you know, he died, I can't remember how many years ago, but I'm always amazed at how he could tell a story, make you laugh, and invoke a special feeling for the person that he had written about or talked about. In his first job, he went to work for Chicago Tribune as a sports writer. And one of his first columns, he said, they have 2 seasons here in Chicago, winter and the 4th of July. He knew he didn't want to last. He didn't want to stay too long in Chicago, so he came back. He was a native Georgian, and he came back to Atlanta and started writing for that paper. And since we're going to be talking about Northerners and Southerners, you know, 200 years ago, I want to relay a story that he told years ago, back when he used to go around talking, giving speeches and things, but he said he was at a convention in Atlanta at a hotel. And it was one of these nice hotels where the balconies faced inward. And they were in a breakout period, and all of a sudden the guy on the 4th floor says, "Look out, down below, I'm going to jump." And this man leaped up and said, "No, sir, think about your wife and children." The man looked down and said, "My wife left me years ago, and my children didn't like me when I was their father." The man looked up and said, "Well, think about your mama and your daddy." He said, "They put me out when I was real young, and they never cared for me either." "Think about Robert E. Lee." "Robert who?" "Go ahead and jump." All right, we're going to start off with a little geographical information. This is the Atlantic Ocean, and I don't mean to, you know, sound like I'm telling y'all something that you don't know, but I just want to orient you as to where we were 200 years ago and what was going on. All right, you can see Murrells Inlet here. In fact, I've got a pointer. You can see Murrells Inlet, you can see Huntington, Atalaya, Pawleys Island, Devido, so you know where you are on the coast. This is the Waccamaw River. These are the names. At that time, Georgetown County had 150 rice plantations on its 5 rivers. These are the names of the plantations on the Waccamaw, the PD, the Black, and then we're going to come on down into the city of Georgetown. Okay, Thurman. All right, so we left the north and we're coming down. Here's Winyah Bay. Now remember, the only way to get into the city of Georgetown by water is from the Atlantic Ocean, come into Winyah Bay, and there's the city of Georgetown right there. The plantations on Winyah Bay, on the Sanpit River, on the North Santee River, and the South Santee River. So Georgetown, you know, is 12 miles inland. It was sort of isolated from outside exposure unless they came in by ship. Okay, sir. Now, what's the county north of us? O'Ree. This is Peter O'Ree. He owned the land where present-day Battery White and Belle Isle are today. Peter O'Ree. He also fought in the American Revolutionary War under Francis Marion. Okay, Thurman. Francis Marion. He had relatives. He was kin to Peter O'Ree. So as a child, he would go to Belle Isle and play with his cousins. He would also watch the ships as they went in and out of Georgetown. And he said, boy, when I grow up, I want to be on one of those ships. Well, he grew up to about age 19. He got on one of those ships. They got into a bad storm. He was down below puking his guts out, and he said, if I ever get home, I will never be on a ship again. Thankfully, he did. He came back. He never went back on another ship, but he, you know, helped South Carolina win the Revolutionary War with his guerrilla warfare. And there are many stories about Francis Marion in this area. Okay, sir. All right, let's move up to April 1861. South Carolina had seceded from the nation, and Fort Sumter was in Charleston Harbor, occupied by the federal troops. And South Carolina didn't want the federal troops on their property, so they bombarded Fort Sumter. And the federal troops left, and the Confederates took occupation of the fort. Okay. By this time, several of the other southern states had seceded also, and the Confederate military was forming at that time. A lot of soldiers, and only 4% of the soldiers fighting in the war were slave owners. So, you know, the majority of the people fighting in the South for the Confederacy were not slave owners. Okay. Now, this bottom part, this pertains to Battery White as compared to what happened during that war. So you can see April 14th, 1861 is when they bombarded Fort Sumter. April 24th, units from the 3rd South Carolina Artillery reinforced South Island Battery, and I'll show you where that is in a few minutes. August 1862, Battery White was selected. Early fall 1862, Battery White was completed and garrisoned with Confederate troops. In February 1863, Battery White was stocked with 9 artillery pieces. Okay. Now, here again, we're looking at this map of Winyah Bay. Belle Isle is right here. Battery White is next. Over here on Frazier Point, which is present-day Hobcaw Barony, there was a Confederate fortification there, and then down here on South Island. Now, the one here on South Island had what they call Quaker guns. They would take they were using all the resources they could, but here on South Island, they didn't have enough guns to place there. So they would take palmetto trees, take the, whatever you call the things going up the tree, take those off, spray paint them black or paint them black, place them in gun enforcement so they look like cannons. So any Union ship coming in, looking through their telescope, they would say, hey, I see 5 or 6 guns on that place. We don't need to go any further. And the lighthouse, it was right along in here. The Confederates occupied it during the start of the war, and they didn't use it for a lighthouse. They used it for a lookout. They could tell if there were any Union ships coming in. They would notify South Island, Frazier Point, and Battery White to man the cannons. Be ready. Okay. Now this is a diagram LeGree Hamilton did back in 1961 of Battery White. This is Winyah Bay out here. These are the ramparts, and there were 7 cannons right here. They were facing Winyah Bay. You could look up Winyah Bay and see North Island. You couldn't see the lighthouse, it's too far away, but you could actually see North Island, okay? Now, Battery White was named after Major Richard Green White, who was a Citadel graduate and a native Georgetownian, okay? Now, the Harvest Moon enters the picture, but the Harvest Moon started off as a ferry boat. It was built in Maine in 1862, and it was going to ferry passengers back and forth up and down the coast, and once a week going to the port of Boston. It was 193 feet long and 29 feet wide, a very luxurious ship at that time. Well, neither the Union Navy nor the Confederate Navy had any new ships. They were still using ships from the Revolutionary War, and the Union Navy had a lot more money than the Confederate Navy, so they bought the Harvest Moon in 1863 for $99,000. They took it to a shipyard, put naval armament on it, and converted it to a naval ship. Now the Harvest Moon, okay, Thurman. The Admiral John Dahlgren, he was in charge of the Harvest Moon. Dahlgren, some of you may have heard of him, he was more into artillery. Several weapons were named after artillery. There's a building or something named for him at the Naval Academy in Maryland. Now, Admiral Dahlgren and the Harvest Moon, okay, they were assigned to the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. Now, the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron was a group of ships that were blockading the port of Charleston, the port of Savannah south of Charleston, and the entrance to Winyah Bay north of Charleston. Now, why were they blocking those 3 ports? Well, the Confederates, they couldn't get any supplies if they couldn't get their ships in, nor could they send out any supplies if they couldn't get past the blockade. So that's why they were blockading those 3 ports. Charleston was one of the richest places on the East Coast at that time. Okay? Now, also part of that blockading squadron was the USS Housatonic. Has anybody ever heard of that ship? Well, it was there in February of 1864. Okay. And guess what happened to the Housatonic? The H.L. Hunley, the only Confederate submarine to sink a U.S. Navy ship, the Housatonic was a victim of the H.L. Hunley in February of 1864. Okay. Now the captain on the USS Housatonic was Captain John Crosby. And we'll come back to Captain Crosby in just a minute. Okay. All right, so we're down to May 1864. The equipment and supplies dwindle at Battery White, and there's desertions are common. All right, now if we go up here to May 21st, 1864, Battle of Spotsylvania. April 9th, 1865, the surrender at Appomattox. So we're in between Battery White being abandoned and the surrender. Okay. Sherman, General Sherman, he's also starting his march to the sea. Now he's got about 70,000 troops. He's going through Georgia, South Carolina, and Mississippi. All right. Now not only are they going through those states, but they're causing devastation to not only buildings, cities, towns, farms, personal homes, private homes, anything they could destroy to weaken the enemy at that time. They were doing it, okay? Railroads, telegraph lines, burning everything, just causing complete destruction. Now, here in Georgetown, once they found out Battery White was deserted, there were 2 men from Georgetown. One happened to live in this house. Anybody know what this house is? Kaminsky House. Thomas Daggett, he was living in this house at the time. He and another friend, I don't have the name of his friend, but they went to the Kaminsky Hardware Building, which is right next to the town clock. The town clock's right here. And it was only 2 stories at the time, but they went to the 2nd story and built 17 keg mines. They would take a 50-gallon barrel drum, remove whatever was in it, fill it full of gunpowder, put a fuse on it, put these cones on the end of it, and they took them out in Winyah Bay on a outgoing tide at night. Now, nobody knew they were out there except for several people here in Georgetown. Okay, Thurman. Now, the USS Harvest Moon in February of 1865, it was coming to Georgetown to accept the surrender papers from the city officials and to declare that all slaves are now free. So they came up the ocean, came into Winyah Bay, okay? Now, City Hall at the time was in the town clock. Admiral Dahlgren went to the town clock. The city officials surrendered the city of Georgetown. There were one or two little skirmishes going on. Some rebels put up a Confederate flag up here, but that didn't last too long. Admiral Dahlgren, he declared that all slaves in Georgetown County are now free. They got back on the Harvest Moon. He pulled out his pocket watch. It's too late to go back to Charleston. What we will do is spend the night docked or anchored right off of Battery White. Now, they had already inspected Battery White. They knew it was deserted. So they went and spent the night off of Battery White. Now, the next morning, they got up at 7:30. Admiral Dahlgren said, let's go to Charleston. They pulled anchor. 5 minutes after they started out, guess what? The USS Harvest Moon, the flagship of the U.S. Navy, the fanciest ship in the U.S. Navy, the fastest ship in the U.S. Navy. Guess what it hit? Okay. It hit one of those mines. And it was only in 15 feet of water. These walls are probably 12 feet tall, so it was just a little bit deeper than this room here. And the upper deck of the Harvest Moon was above the waterline. The crew on the upper deck thought a boiler had blown up. That's when they went rushing down below. They saw a dead steward who had just served Admiral Dahlgren coffee. He was the only fatality from the explosion. They saw a big 10 by 12 foot hole in the starboard side midship with water, pluff mud, fish, and everything gushing in. Well, they didn't like that. But they did what they could to salvage that ship. They could not salvage it. They spent about 6 weeks trying to salvage the flagship of the U.S. Navy. They couldn't do it. They took the naval hardware off the ship. They abandoned the ship. Admiral Dahlgren had to write the Secretary of the Navy, sir, I regret to inform you, but the USS Harvest Moon, our flagship, is a casualty as a result of a Confederate mine built by the Confederates. The only U.S. Navy flagship ever sunk by a Confederate mine. Okay, Thurman. Today, you can still see the top of the smokestack. It's exposed, and it sits there 154 years later after it was sunk. Okay. Guess who the captain was on that ship under Admiral Dahlgren? Captain John Crosby. Now, he's got 2 ships that have been sunk or blown up from underneath him. He retires from the Navy. The Navy's not too happy with him. He tries to draw his pension. They put him off, but he finally gets $25 a month for the rest of his life. He didn't live too many years after that, but we've given him the name Captain Crunch. All right, April 1865, General Lee says, boys, we can't go any further, it's time to surrender. So at Appomattox Courthouse, he goes and meets General Grant, okay? They sign the surrender papers, okay? Shake hands, and the Confederates go home. A lot of them, what few animals they still had, they rode those, but a lot of the Confederate soldiers had to walk home because, you know, the animals were gone. All right? They came home, they saw their burned out houses, their property that was destroyed, okay? The cities that were completely obliterated. You know, the homes, if they were standing, the fields were gone. Okay. Let me read this for you. From 1865 to 1867, when Reconstruction got underway, the Southerner was occupied with physically rebuilding the South with little time to entertain political thoughts. Confederate generals plowed fields with broken down old plows in the same way as their neighbor who might have been a lowly private. Men of former means sat in the midst of demolished cities, cleaning mortar off bricks, which would be used to construct a new building if and when the money could be found to erect such a structure. There were virtually no fences left, the rails having been burned for firewood. Even if there had been fences, cattle had long ago been driven off, killed, or eaten by invading Yankees. Where once had been miles of lovely homes, neatly framed by well-kept gardens, only tall blackened chimneys now stood. Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and South Carolina had been thoroughly sacked and burned. Hardly a cotton gin stood anywhere in Dixie. Homes that weren't burned to the ground were systematically looted with the passing of every Yankee army. Federal authorities occupying the South forbid any display of Confederate flags or any other visible symbol of the Confederacy. All insignia, even buttons on uniforms, often the only clothes the soldier possessed, had to be removed or covered. Whitelaw Reid, a well-known journalist at the time, witnessed what he described as a brutal scene at a hotel in Savannah, where a drunken Union sergeant with a pair of tailor's shears insisted on cutting the buttons from the uniform of an elegant, gray-headed brigadier general who had just come in from Confederate General Joe Johnston's surrender. Henry Douglas, once a member of Stonewall Jackson's staff, agreed to a lady friend's request to have his photograph made in his uniform. He was detected in this heinous act, arrested, accused of treason, and thrown in jail. On Memorial Day at Arlington Cemetery, United States soldiers stood guard to make sure no flowers were placed on the graves of the Confederate dead. Okay, Thomas. At the Antietam burial ground, the question of whether Southern soldiers deserved a decent burial was finally settled in the affirmative, only because hogs were rooting up their remains and scattering them around the battlefield. Okay, Tom. All right, what came south? Carpetbaggers and scallywags. Y'all know what scallywags are? They were Confederate soldiers who were Confederate people from the South who joined the carpetbaggers to take advantage of, what was going on with political turmoil. Okay, Thurman. All right, one more. In 1870, out of 155 legislators, 144 were radical Republicans, and only 22 of the 98 elected Negroes could read or write. The governor himself was a carpetbagger, and they all voted for themselves gold watches, horses, carriages, and champagne, and other outlandish things, quickly bankrupting South Carolina, with the state debt rising from $7 million to $29 million. Republican Senator Honest John Patterson, he was from Pennsylvania, and he was quoted in 1873 as saying, "There are still 5 good years of stealing in South Carolina." Now, the way he got his nickname, Honest John, if he promised you a bribe, he would pay it. So that's why they call him Honest John. All right, sir. Now, what was going on at Battery White while all this was going on throughout the state? Well, when Admiral Dahlgren and his men, when they toured Battery White, they found it was empty, abandoned, so they took the cannons off their mounts and just left them on the ground, okay? Now, not too much notice came to Georgetown until President Grover Cleveland came down for a duck hunt in 1894. Prior to that, in 1893, he had gone duck hunting in the Outer Banks, but in 1894, a former Confederate general, Edward Porter Alexander, owned South Island. And he and Grover Cleveland, they were friends, so he invited him down for a duck hunt. Well, while he was here duck hunting, somehow or another, he either fell out of the boat or stepped out of the boat. And he was a rather portly man, weighed about 250, 300 pounds, and pluff mud. He wasn't in deep water. Y'all know what pluff mud is? I'm sure some of you. Pluff mud is not like quicksand. It doesn't pull you under, but you can't pull yourself out. You've got to stand still and have somebody pull you, or lay down and try to crawl out. But the guides that he was with, they pulled him out, and we didn't have 24/7 news at that time, so several weeks after that, a month after that, word got out that the president was hunting ducks in Georgetown County. Now, ducks love Georgetown County because of the abandoned rice fields, all the impoundments we have. So duck hunters, they found out Georgetown was a haven for ducks. A lot of the former plantations were for sale at very low deflated prices, and they started coming, what we call the second Yankee invasion. They started coming down and buying the former plantations. By 1930, 85% of the former plantations were owned by wealthy Northerners who were using them as hunting retreats. Bernard Baruch, he bought present-day Hobcall Barony back in 1905. Very low price. I think there were 14 plantations at that time. He bought 7 of those, and then 2 years later bought the remaining plantations. He did away with the individual names and gave it the name Hobcall Barony. Does everybody know what Hobcall means? Hobcall is an Indian word meaning between the waters. Hobcall Barony sits, the front of it sits on the Waccamaw River, the backside sits on the Atlantic Ocean, 16,000 acres. So Mr. Baruch was one of the first to buy large tracts of land. Okay, Thurman. Also Tom Yawkey. He inherited South Island from his uncle who had died when Tom Yawkey was 16 years old. But in his will, Tom Yawkey couldn't touch any of it until he turned 30. So when he turned 30, he inherited all these multi-millions of dollars and all this land that make up South Island and North Island. Okay? Isaac Emerson. He was a chemist, and he bought several of the plantations on the Waccamaw, Prospect Hill, Friendfield. He did away with their individual names and gave it the name Arcadia, which is what we know it as today. Okay? And then the Huntingtons, you know, they bought several plantations up on the Waccamaw, which are now present-day Brook Green Gardens. So Georgetown County, and in fact, several months ago, the speaker, Vivian, you know,
Daniel Vivian, yes.
Excellent presentation on the plantations here in Georgetown County and how they were bought. Okay? Now in 1951, Mr. Johnstone, who at that time owned Belle Isle and the property known as Battery White, he died in 1951. In 1917, he had owned Esterville Plantation and shortly afterwards purchased Belle Isle. Since that time, he has spent his entire time in the development of Belle Isle as a horticultural garden, planting thousands of azaleas, camellias, and other types of shrubbery there. Okay. People used to come from all around to go visit the gardens at Belle Isle. Okay. Some of the prettiest azaleas, the Spanish moss hanging on the old live oaks. This home burned in 1940. Okay. Now, what was happening to Battery White while people were visiting Belle Isle and seeing the lovely gardens? Well, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, they said we need to do something to remember the men who fought for the men and women, the people who sacrificed for the Confederacy. Okay? So in 1929, they started collecting money to put a monument at Battery White. Right here, they collected $39.05. All right? Now, this was Friday, May 24th, 1929. Exercises will mark the unveiling of the boulder on May 25th. They're now up to $150. Okay? Boulder unveiled at Belle Isle on Saturday. Now, the people who erected this boulder, Brown's Memorials out of Florence. In 1929, a company out of Florence who were in the monument tombstone business, they designed this monument, okay, and put it on top of one of the ramparts there at Battery White. And you can see what it says, lest we forget, in memory of the Confederate soldiers who served at Battery White during the war between the states, 1861, 1865, erected by the Arthur Manigault Chapter, United Daughters of the Confederacy, May 25th, 1929. Now, it was on a concrete base, a cement base, and it stood there for about 70 years, okay? And this was an ad or something that was in the Georgetown Times 75 years ago, back when it was 1942, what you could see at Belle Isle if you came and visited. Okay? All right, and also the Charleston paper, they used to have a lot of stories about Georgetown and, you know, Belle Isle, okay? This was the house that burned, I tell you, in 1940. All right, so now we're up to 1961. Our country is getting ready to celebrate the centennial of the war. Lots of things going on in Charleston where, it all started, okay? In 1964, the U.S. Navy, they sent a team of divers to Georgetown to dive on the Harvest Moon to see if it could be raised. This would make a good centennial 100-year anniversary. These rods you see, those are steel rods. They poked through the pluff mud to see how thick the mud was on the ship, how deep it was. It's still in shallow water. There's a sandbar over here that limits access to it unless you're on a small boat. But they determined the Harvest Moon was still in good shape, but the mud, the pluff mud, had just filled it up on the inside and all around it, and it was going to cost too much money to raise it. So at that time, the U.S. Navy relinquished ownership of it and gave it to the state of South Carolina. So the state of South Carolina still owns it today. There are divers who dive on it and historical groups who have dove on it in years past to see if they could raise it, but they all face the same thing, money, money, money. In fact, back in the 60s, there was a man who came to Georgetown and he said, we're going to build a nautical maritime museum in the building on the corner of Broad and Front, where the old rice paddy used to be. And he collected money, he collected cannonballs and other articles and artifacts that people had, and then during the night, he disappeared with the money and the artifacts. He said he was going to build a periscope on the outside of that building, and you could look in it, street level, and see the Harvest Moon. But, you just couldn't do it, but that was one of his selling points. So, but anyway, the state now owns the USS Harvest Moon. People have dove on it to see if they could raise it, but it's going to cost too much money, so it sits there 154 years later, just the top of the smokestack, okay? Now, Battery White. Now, Mr. Johnstone, who died back in 1951, this was his son, Billy Johnstone. He said, I want to do something with Battery White in Belle Isle, okay? So he sold Belle Isle. Shirley, how long were you living there?
Since 1992.
Okay, all right. Shirley lived out there a long time. But they wanted to put condominiums, develop Belle Isle, but they were going to save Battery White, okay? So they did some campaigns, Discover Belle Isle, luxury condominiums on the historic coastal plantation, the villas, the yacht club, waterway villas are now available on Winyah Bay. 2 of the cannons are still there today, okay? This was an aerial view of Belle Isle, the yacht club, the Coast Guard station. They moved there sometime in the late 70s. Battery White would be right along in here. This is Winyah Bay going on into Georgetown, okay? And what I liked best about their ad was come listen to our quiet. Okay? They even had little brochures and maps made, giving you the history of Belle Isle, okay? Even a walking trail or a bike path, showing you where the different points of interest were, okay? And then they would name them: Site of Francis Marion Boyhood Home, Cooling House, Indian Burial Ground, the Harvest Moon. First Spanish settlement in America was over there on the Hobcall, we hope. Like I told you, the Coast Guard built a Coast Guard station there in the late 70s, stayed there for about 10 or 12 years. The yacht club, all this area, started silting in. This was actually like a pontoon boat, and the silt became so great, the water became so shallow that the boat was actually sitting in the mud. So that's when they moved to the present Coast Guard station up here by the Hampton Inn, okay? Now, like I told you, the base of the monument was starting to crumble 70 years later. So the Sons of Confederate Veterans, the Battery White Sons of Confederate Veterans, and the Arthur Manigo Daughters of the United Confederacy, they got together and said we need to save this monument. Plus, it was on one of the ramparts, and kids go up there and play, and it could fall on them or they could push it over. This thing must weigh, I don't know how much, 2 tons? I don't know how much it weighs. So the SCV and the UDC, they got together, okay, and paid private money, paid to have the monument removed, okay, put on another base down closer to the road that goes to the clubhouse. So that was in 97. That's been, what, 20, 30 years ago? And, okay, Ms. Nell Cribb, many of y'all remember her. She was very instrumental with the UDC and leading that charge to have it moved, okay? And this was the SCV. They were working together with the UDC to have it moved. They had a ceremony there. I think there were, Jimmy, help me out, weren't there 2 or 3 people who were there whose parents or grandparents or relatives had been at the unveiling in 1929? I think Miss Nell Cribb found several of those, okay? And there it sits right there where it's been since 1997, okay? Now, what happened to the cannons at Battery White? Well, on the side facing Wynyard Bay, there were 7 cannons. 2 of those cannons are still there, okay, Thurman? These are the 2 that are still there. The other 5, okay, 2 of those are at Constitution Park, right up here on Front Street, okay? There's one at the National Guard Armory on 17 South. There's one at the War Memorial over here on 17 by the VFW and the American Legion. And the South Carolina Maritime Museum. If you want to see a model of the Harvest Moon, see what it actually looked like, okay, Thurman, there it sits. It's in a glass case, but there's a well-done model of the USS Harvest Moon with a lot more history than what I've given you today. Okay. Now, you've seen throughout the country and on the news, a lot of people, or not a lot, but some people want to do with anything named after members of the Confederacy. Stonewall Jackson School, they want to do away with it, okay? There are monuments that people are spray painting, monuments that people are tearing down, monuments that they want removed, okay? Look at the names of the military fortifications here in the South that are named after Confederate soldiers. What are they going to do with those? Okay? Now, I'm sure all of you back at one time read 1984. Every record has been destroyed or falsified, every book rewritten, every picture has been repainted, every statue and street building has been renamed, every date has been altered, and the process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped, nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. So this group who want to do away with Confederate statues, that's not really their objective. They want to do away with Confederate statues, but then they're going after American history. Anything prior to the Confederacy, they're going after all that. You've seen the mural in a California school, George Washington, they want to paint over that. A pioneer statue in the state of Oregon, they want to take it down. Okay. But thankfully, nothing like that has happened here. The monument is still standing. This is a Confederate First National flag flying in front of it. The UDC and the SCB, thankfully, they continue to keep it up and make it nice for everyone to enjoy. I thank y'all very much for putting up with me. And I'll be glad to answer any questions you may have.
Battery White was all earthenworks. It wasn't brick walls.
They may have had some bricks on it, but it was mostly earthenworks. And in fact, if you go out to Belle Isle, a lot of people think Battery White just faces Wynyard Bay. There's a back earthwork also that went around the back because Pemberton or whoever helped design Battery White said, you know, they may not all come in by the water. They may come in the water. But you can see the earthworks are still there on the back wall. All right, thank y'all very much.